So a free trade agreement is a formal arrangement between two or more countries that are designed to break down barriers to trade between those countries. Really important to be able to differentiate between bilateral trade agreement, such as CERTA, which is between Australia and New Zealand, and ChAFTA, which is between China and Australia. So this stands for Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement. Doesn't really give you any hint to who it's between, but it is Australia and New Zealand. And then ChAFTA is China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. Bilateral, pretty self-explanatory, bi meaning two. So only two countries can be involved in a bilateral agreement. But then multilateral, multi meaning multiple. So you've got the EU, NAFTA, which is North America Free Trade Agreement, APEC, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is TPP. And you can also have global trade agreements such as the WTO as well. So really important that you understand the difference between bilateral and multilateral in particular. So looking at some trends in free trade agreements, regional trade agreements have multiplied. There was only 27 in 1990, and by 2007 there was 445, highlighting the emergence of regionalism, not globalization. So essentially regionalism being trade between particular countries within specific regions rather than just trade with anyone in the world who wants to trade. So risk with regional trade agreements is that it does hinder the spread of global free trade as the regions only trade between themselves. And then if you do have things like trading blocks, this trade between regions comes at the exclusion of other economies. So looking at some examples, we've got first the EU. So the European Union is the most important trade bloc in the world economy, can also be considered a multilateral trade agreement. 28 member countries in 2016 and 19 had the euro as their currency. The EU has tended to raise tariff barriers against non-member countries, essentially creating a trading bloc that happens at the exclusion of everybody else. But it provides direct subsidies to agricultural products to support farmers. But with the USA retaliated with similar protectionist policies, which became a problem for Australia and smaller economies. So again, when you're talking about free trade and pros and cons of free trade agreements, something that you can talk about is that free trade agreements can encourage the retaliation effect, which is essentially where certain agreements that come at the exclusion to other people cause those other economies to then create their own protectionist policies, which just goes back and forth until protection keeps getting piled on, which typically affects smaller economies and doesn't tend to affect the big ones like the EU or the US. Then we've got subsidies have caused production surplus, which is then dumped onto foreign markets and creates problems for farmers in developing nations because of those protectionist policies. Again, looking at dumping, which is probably the big reason that you wouldn't want to do free trade because you cannot fix that organically. So problems with multilateral trade agreements, trade blocks, things like that, is that you can't stop countries from leaving them. So essentially, the EU faced the departure of one of its biggest economies via Brexit. So if you want to talk about disadvantages of trading blocks, you can talk about the fact that you cannot stop countries leaving them, essentially. Like, yes, there's a lot of work, but it is still possible. And then you can talk about your example being Brexit. So then we've got APEC, which is another multilateral trade agreement. So APEC stands for Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, which was formed in the 1990s as a result of various trading blocs. So it does include 21 member countries, including Australia, China, Russia, and the US. And it accounts for 40% of the world's population, 59% of world GDP, and 49% of world trade. And for Australia specifically, it accounts for 75% of our trade. So this forum is a non-discriminatory group as they can trade with other countries outside the group. So this is why it is a multilateral trade agreement as opposed to a trading bloc, because it doesn't come at the exclusion of other countries. So it does actually encourage greater cooperation and openness to globalization. And it's very supportive of the WTO by removing artificial barriers, such as the average tariff levels in the region since 1994 have fallen from 16.9% to 5.6% in 2014. APEC meetings in recent years have also shifted to non-trade issues as well, so it can also become just a general political forum for these countries as well. Now we've got NAFTA, very big multilateral trade agreement, North America Free Trade, established in 1994, made up of your countries in North America, so you've got USA, Canada, Mexico. It's a free trade agreement where agricultural protection is completely eliminated and other tariffs are essentially trying to be phased out over the period between 5 and 15 years. That being said, it's quite good in that there's no protection in agricultural production in these regions. However, there have been American workers who have lost their jobs as manufacturing has shifted to Mexico due to access to cheaper labor, essentially making it more efficient to produce a lot of manufacturing in Mexico instead. However, like what we talked about with the disadvantages of free trade, that is an issue that should organically correct itself with American workers then being allocated to more efficient industries in the future. So next, we'll talk about ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is essentially an effective force for trade negotiations within the Asia Pacific, as it acted as a counterweight to APEC. So then in 2010, they introduced AANZ FTA, which included Australia and New Zealand free trade area with the Asian nations, which committed to eliminating tariffs on 96% of Australian exports. Important to note there that ASEAN does not include Australia. The AANZ FTA is something that is complementary to ASEAN, but does not now include Australia. And it is now, AANZ FTA is now the largest preferential trade agreement that Australia has concluded as well. So then your bilateral trade agreements, free trade agreements between two countries, the big ones in Australia, ChAFTA between Australia and New Zealand, which led to the elimination of trade restrictions between Australia and New Zealand completely. Between Australia and New Zealand, there is no protection. There's not allowed to be any protection between goods and services importing and exporting, and thus there's been an 8% increase in trade. Other big ones for Australia, ChAFTA, ChAFTA, NAFTA. If you Google Australia bilateral trade agreements, you'll see a whole list of them pop up. I would say it's good to be well versed on at least a few of Australia's bilateral trade agreements in case you need to talk about them in an essay. So as an example of one of Australia's free trade agreements, probably one of Australia's biggest ones is ChAFTA. Came about in 2016, which aimed to eliminate 86% of tariffs upon initial implementation and 96% of tariffs between Australia and China by 2029. Focus on agriculture and raw materials, as China is Australia's largest trading partner, and China has access to Australia's services such as education, tourism, and legal. And there's a strong resurgence in recent years of bilateral trade agreements due to the slow progress of the WTO. So when you're doing your research about bilateral trade agreements, you'll actually notice that a lot of them are fairly recent. I say recent in loose terms because, for economics, 10, 20 years is considered recent because of slow progress in the WTO. Something important to consider when you're talking about pros and cons of bilateral trade agreements is that they cannot completely stop a country from going against them. If you guys are well versed on Australia and China's economic relationship, you'll know that in 2020, there was some big problems between Australia and China because Australia chose to participate in an investigation into the origins of COVID-19. China were not very happy with Australia, and they chose to implement some tariffs on big Australian productions such as barley and wine, which has reduced Australia's exports to China and exports in general, because a fair majority of Australia's exports go to China, and all of a sudden it became really expensive to export into China, and so those exports had nowhere to go. So if you want to talk about the complexity of bilateral trade agreements, which I do encourage you to do, it'll help your essay be a lot more complex and have a lot more nuances to it. Do some research into Australia and China's trade relationship in 2022 and 2023 as just examples of how a bilateral trade agreement cannot completely stop a country from retaliating, essentially, as well.